Good morning, everybody, and how nice to have the sun washing down through the windows on such a lovely day. Forgive me.
Mrs. Pacey, she's just gone out the back to go down and shut that.
So, instilling discernment, how can schools best equip boys to navigate misinformation and build critical thinking skills? Today's discussion is in essence about truth, which, as you'll have noticed, is currently having a slightly complicated relationship with the internet, social media, and indeed certain globally prominent figures. We live in an age where information is more abundant than ever before. Unfortunately, in some quarters, so is confidence in that information, regardless of whether it has any basis in reality whatsoever. We're at a point in human history where it is very easy to be both apparently extremely well-informed and spectacularly wrong at the same time. For boys growing up today, the challenge is not access to knowledge, it's the navigation of it. They are encountering a world of algorithms, echo chambers, viral content, and increasingly convincing AI deepfakes, often before they've fully mastered the art of encasing their own belongings or reliably having a shower when they should. The challenge is knowing which things are worth knowing, which sources are worth trusting, and when to pause to consider before confidently announcing something that turns out to have originated from a meme posted 3 minutes ago. Schools, meanwhile, are increasingly required to act not just as providers of knowledge, but as guides through this rather chaotic landscape, helping boys to question, to evaluate, and crucially to do so without sliding into the uncomfortable and unhelpful position of assuming that everything is equally unreliable. So today's question, how can schools best equip boys to navigate misinformation and build critical thinking skills, is not simply about academic technique, it's about judgment, habits of mind, and the formation of young men who can engage thoughtfully and responsibly with the world around them. We're very fortunate to explore this with three. We're very fortunate to explore this with three senior educationists. There used to be four, but we have apologies from Charter House. I can.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. I'm just going to write shotgun at the side. Who obviously have to think about these challenges deeply on a day-to-day basis and grapple with them in real time in their own schools. So let me please introduce our panelists today. Immediately to my right, as you look, is Chris Fowler, who is Deputy Head Pupils at Brighton College. Following a degree in modern languages and history, Chris has been a teacher and school leader for the last 2 decades. He began his career teaching modern languages at the South London Comprehensive School, and for the subsequent 18 years has taught in 2 leading UK independent schools, including a 9-year tenure as housemaster at King's College School, Wimbledon, where he also coached cricket, squash and football. Since joining Brighton in 2017, he's held leadership roles as head of middle school, deputy head common room, and is now deputy head pupils, overseeing pastoral care and pupil development. Very warm welcome, Chris. Next is Neil Parker, the head of King Edward's in Southampton. Neil has been head there since September 2019, and he joined from the grammar school at Leeds, where he served as vice principal and head of the senior school. Educated at the British School in the Netherlands and the Purcell School of Music before reading music at Oxford, he's taught in major independent schools from London all the way up to Newcastle, and for many years was also an active inspector for the RSI Inspectorate. We won't hold that against him. He has served on the board of Leeds College of Music and is currently a governor of a local state primary in Southampton. Very well welcome, Neil. And familiar to many of you, but I will, as we were just discussing beforehand, I will read her biography out, just in case we have some new faces in the audience. Elizabeth Stone is, of course, headmaster of Winchester College and has experience of both co-ed and single-sex day and boarding schools in Australia and the UK. Prior to Winchester, she spent 9 years as principal of Queenwood School, Sydney, a leading independent girls' school with 900 pupils. She was vice principal of Cheltenham Ladies College from 2012 to 14, and immediately before this, she spent 3 years at Winchester as a maths teacher and undermaster. Imagine going back to the head of the school you once taught at. Who would do that? At Oxford University, she studied as a Rhodes Scholar and completed a master's degree at University College before going on to specialise in commercial contract law ahead of commencing her teaching career. Would you please join me in warming our new panels. I shall put my teeth back in and promptly start with question 1. Okay, so colleagues, we haven't prepared who's going to speak first, but please feel free to take the reins after this. So fundamentally, what do you think has changed in the information landscape of late, and why does it now matter so urgently for schools? Who would like to say that?
Well, I mean, I'll start just saying, rather helpfully, you've already given the answer to that in your introduction. I think it's a false narrative to say that misinformation and this environment which young people confront is a new thing. It has already existed, as you rightly said in your introduction. It's about the pace and the multitude of routes by which that's delivered to young people, and most critically, the fact that there are now it is now actually a heat-seeking sort of approach. So the sort of algorithmic targeting of young people is a real thing. So what I see on social media, which is largely consisting of puppies falling over and things like that, is simply not what my son sees on social media. And so I can't apply my experience of social media to that of a young person. And that targeting, that use of, as you rightly said, echo chambers. I mean, echo chambers are not an accident, they're not a blip, they are the product itself. They are how the companies who are producing this and the individuals who are producing this target engagement, because engagement is what they are, not truth, not learning, not facts, but engagement, and that's what they work on. So that sort of algorithmic targeting, I think, is the thing that is new. Before that, misinformation is sort of floated through the ether, or indeed just through the world, and hope that someone will encounter it, or now it's actually aimed at itself.
I would absolutely agree with that, but perhaps I would add just another phrase, another way to describe it. Those echo chambers, they have become sycophantic feedback loops, which are very dangerous when a young person gets trapped in that loop. And we'll come on to this later, but this is what makes it all the more important, that if we are trying to remove or reduce some of those things for our young people, that we give them an alternative that has meaning for them. I think also, as Neil has just said, this is not a new issue. This issue is as old as time, that older generations will worry about new generations coming through, but it is the turbocharged nature of the negative influences as we see them that is the concern. And I think that generation, for us, dealing with secondary school children and preparing them for university, that generation from 16 to 24, that age group, they have always been the loneliest generation, which might come as a surprise in that we often think of the elderly as the loneliest generation, but it is that generation that is loneliest, and that has roots in evolution. It's a time where young people are splitting from their family and finding their independence, but that loneliness can be compounded by finding kinship online via AI, via echo chambers, in a way that can speed up negative influences far quicker than it ever has done before.
I mean, you could go in 100 directions on this, so let's not try and do all of them at once, but there has been a critical move, even since the beginning of the internet, which is that we've gone to the visual. And so it's kind of weird. We've invested so much time over the last 2,000 years in the written word and the sort of spread of ideas and the complexity that you can then engage with ideas through words and through extended writing. Now the writing is anything but extended, and it's hyper-visual. And I think that is a really severe limit. When you look at the statistics about how people get information about the world now, they're pretty much, most people, particularly young people, getting it from online, and they're getting it through the platforms that are primarily visual. That already just undercuts what can actually be conveyed. And I mean, philosophers have philosophized for centuries about the degree to which our minds, our thought thoughts are formed by the language that we speak and the sort of interaction of that. But actually we're starting to give away the full power of language. So I just think that's another sort of very hard to challenge on those platforms. You know, so it's one thing to say, well, we should be out there on TikTok and Insta Reels and whatever. Sure, except the medium itself is incredibly limiting for the kind of thinking that we're wanting to encourage. So, you know, you talked about the attention economy. Creating people who have sufficient attention to be able to engage with other media is also part of the necessity.
And that visual presentation, I absolutely agree, that visual presentation by definition removes the struggle to engage with that information, so it creates a bypass as well. So it creates a route around the brain almost. It makes things far more visceral, far more direct. And actually the struggle is an important part of developing critical faculty. So without the struggle, there's a real temptation to more easily accept as truth something that is palatable and in how it's presented as well as its content.
I absolutely agree. Our young people are digesting other people's and machines' summaries of information that they once upon a time would have had to have assimilated themselves. And I think to Elizabeth's point as well, the National Literacy Trust statistics show that in 2025 only 18.7% of 8 to 14-year-olds read daily for pleasure, and that is the lowest level since records began, those particular records in 2005. So 20 years of erosion of that reading for pleasure. And so it's not just looking at what are the dangers of these online tools, it's also what are they replacing, what are our young people missing out on as a result of looking for that knowledge delivered in sound bites that are often incomplete.
Just to pick up on the point that you're making here about the difference between the visual and the written, and the way that the visual is visceral and short form in many ways, is it plays into the danger, doesn't it? That we can talk about young boys here at Pilgrims. You know, binary narratives always appeal to young boys, heroes versus villains, and all of these sorts of things, and that the shorter the form, the more binary the temptation is to make it in order to land your point. And I was at a conference about 2 months ago, at which Rory Stewart was a keynote speaker, and he made a point which was blindingly obvious, but which I'd never really connected with before, which was when most of us were growing up. You know, if we were here in the UK, our exposure to what a narrative truth might be came through a very small number of media channels that presented news programmes on television. You know, our household, as many other households I'm sure, it has been BBC. If you're particularly off-field, you might be Channel 4 News, but either way, you had about 3 choices, and that was it. And that's where we received our narrative, what was going on outside of our immediate world. And our children nowadays are exposed to multiple narratives. And I suppose what we're coming into, isn't it, to explore how they discern from those narratives, because from for those that are not in the education world, an interesting feature of the latest safeguarding guidance from the government is actually now tying in with the idea of misinformation and indeed disinformation, and what those two actually have from a safeguarding point of view to influence our children. And we've been used to talking about screen time, but actually it's now, I think, perhaps more wise to think of it as sort of meaning-making time. In other words, what meaning are our children gaining from the time that they are exposed online, and what truths are they being exposed to, in inverted commas, that may or may not be what they pertain to be. So, yeah, I think, do we agree that this is, well, so let's finish with this question. Is this fundamentally different from what other generations have faced? Because of your first point, that these things have existed, but now we're in a very different ballpark.
So, by the way, thank you for coming out on this beautiful sunny day. I hope you're all feeling reasonably positive still after these first but the truth is, yes, this is a different time, because there is a dynamism and a proactivity to the way that this misinformation is being spread. And that is different. So it's a two-way process in a way that has not been the case, which means that, so to take the obvious example you were sort of alluding to, Tim, it was perfectly fine when I was at school to be able to pick a book off the shelf and say, this is authoritative. Why is it authoritative? Because someone has published it, generally it's been peer-reviewed, and actually that wasn't entirely accurate, but when it was a single point of view, the harm was relatively minor. So you could just go, well, this is in a book, it must be true. And so the same lack of discernment could exist at that time and have far fewer consequences. When that simply isn't the case, when there is such a swirl of information, then you can't have that attitude. As I say, I don't think that we were more discerning as young people than children are today. It's just it didn't matter as much that we weren't as discerning as young people. And that's the fundamental difference. It now matters. And what we have to teach as parents, as schools, as educators, is different.
You mentioned the word discernment, which we can seamlessly use to slide into question 2, which is, as educationists and parents, what are the key habits of mind and sort of dispositions that we are trying to cultivate in boys if they're going to navigate this information well?
So one of the most misunderstood things in education, and I thought this a while ago until I became better informed, was that critical skills can exist in a general sense, that you can have a trained and disciplined mind that just, no matter what you turn it to, thinks critically. It turns out that that is not how our brains work, that our ability to think critically and our ability, our capacity for robust analysis and so on, is heavily dependent on how much we already know about the thing in question. So I can't just take a disciplined mind that's really, really good at problem solving in applied mathematics and go, and here's a history problem and I'll apply the same approach. Turns out it doesn't work. And so the founding sort of platform for our children has to be a base of knowledge. And again, we've tried, and particularly over the last 10 to 20 years with information literacy, and we're all worried about misinformation and so on. People have done loads and loads of studies about, are there skills that we can teach them so that when they're researching online, we give them a kind of checklist, like does it look like this, or does it do this, or what's the source of... it turns out, at the edges, there's some things you can do to improve it, but actually, the really effective thing is to actually know something about the topic, right? So if you know something about, I don't know, cells and immune systems, then your ability to assess claims about vaccinations is just going to be better than any generalized thinking skill that I can offer you. And that is both encouraging in the sense it gives us a very clear path forward as educators and as parents, which is take this child that can, has so much capacity to absorb and just expose them as broadly and widely as possible to lots of ideas. And so it's encouraging from that point of view. It's slightly discouraging because there's no sort of magic pill where we go into critical thinking and problem solving lessons and then they come out and they can tackle anything. I always come back to there has to be a base of knowledge. Anybody who gets sufficiently good at something acquires at some point some epistemic humility, right? Maths, I'm a maths teacher by background, right? Maths is wonderful. At some point, maths gets too hard for everybody, right? Richard Feynman just says, I still can't understand this. I can do it, but I don't understand it, right? So it's wonderful that you hit the barriers, wherever it is in what you know, and that starts to cultivate, I think, demeanours and attitudes and dispositions. But sometimes I think we worry too much about critical thinking skills. And then someone like Ken Robinson gets up, and like, bless him, he can deliver a TED talk. Whew. But, totally vacuous. Because, he's out there going, creativity. No one knows how to teach creativity. No, we don't even know how to measure it. Even if we could teach it, we wouldn't be able to tell that we were doing it, right? There just has to be a focus on the things that we can do, and one of them is that we can teach kids a lot about the world. We can have some epistemic humility, but not to the point where, I mean, one of the issues, and this is kind of Nietzsche via Foucault, right, which is that there's no objective truth, and therefore any assertion of truth is just an exercise of power, right? So Monty Python, you know, someone says, you know, that claim's ridiculous, don't you oppress me, right? So we are in a world where that is increasingly the mode of discourse, and we have actually, I mean, because we're reacting against, you know, the caricature. Actually, I don't think the Victorians were that stupid, but we have in our mind the caricature of the Victorians who are out there, you know, so completely certain of the world that they made horrendous mistakes and did terrible things, right? And so as a reaction to that, we're like, don't take a firm view on anything because everything is to be questioned. And that is a recipe for despair. It's one of the reasons children are so unhappy. And I'll finish, I'm talking a lot, but this anecdote, I thought, I've got to share this today. This is the moment. This was some years ago, and I was invited to do an introduction to philosophy class with some kids at my school, previous school. And I had a vision. I was going to do some moral philosophy, we were going to do sort of teleological and deontological thinking and blah, blah, you know, I had this lesson plan in my head. And what I wanted to, you know, throw up was, you know, sometimes we think teleologically about the results and outcome, that's what makes it moral, and sometimes things are just wrong. So I tried to get them started on that, and it was sort of going well until I said, now, can any of you suggest something that's just wrong? You know, it's just always wrong. There's sort of crickets. And I prodded a bit, and I tried to get them to make a firm statement about something, anything that was wrong. I couldn't get them to say, they wouldn't say anything. I said, okay, well, let me, you know, start for 10. How about killing babies for fun? Could we agree that that is wrong? They couldn't bring themselves, even in front of their head, to say that that was, because they've been taught it's sort of impolite and oppressive and so on. And so there's this weird recipe for, and I mean, the irony was we had a babysitting list where you could hire these teenagers to look after your children. It was perfectly safe. They didn't actually believe it, but the stifling of discourse, because we're afraid of putting an opinion out, because that's tied to the fundamentally a belief in objective reality. And all of this is underpinning the sorts of online phenomena that we've got. So it's really, this is to tackle this in isolation as if it's a problem with education, which I don't think anybody is really. I think we recognise in society, but we are losing the institutions and the communities that are confident in telling young people some things are true and some things are not. And sometimes we get it wrong, right? And you know, we all know that, and so it would be terrible if along with that came a recipe for you can't challenge it. But if we don't have confidence to say some things are wrong, and some beliefs are better than others, and some values are more important than others, I mean, these are all very countercultural statements, right? Who wants to get out there and say that? But we have to be clear that that corrodes the underpinnings of these young people's perspective on the world. And then, you know, getting into a history or a politics lesson and engaging with different perspectives, we just don't have a firm footing on which to have that argument. Sorry, I did go on.
No. I was gonna caveat Elizabeth's first point with the point that she made second, which is knowledge is important, but one of the problems is that a little bit of knowledge can be quite dangerous when you're talking about operating on a selective, shall we say, online space, and especially intelligent, proud teenagers, dare I even say boys, often that little bit of knowledge can prove the dangerous element. So Elizabeth's second point was that we need humility. Intellectual humility is so important to temper conclusions we might jump to. So I agree with everything Elizabeth said, but I do, there clearly is some critical thinking that needs to go on alongside that raw knowledge. And actually, so I want to talk a little bit about the values that I think are really important for our young people, our young men to have when they're approaching these online spaces. Before I do, we had a speaker yesterday at Brighton College who's a professional football manager, and we were sort of investigating the difference in leadership and management in the Premier League to the independent education sector. And I asked him something about how he brought along these young guys whose focus was football and nothing else. And he talked about values, but he said, when I ask young academy players, what are your values? He said almost without fail, they look at him blankly and they don't know what values are. And he said, it's actually refreshing. The only answer I got, and I was delighted to get it, was that some would say money. And he said, okay, well fine, at least now I've got something to work with. You want financial security and stability. I get it, you've come from a background where you didn't have it. And that was at least a value he could then work with to bring others along. So we talk a lot at Brighton about three very important values of curiosity, confidence and kindness. And I start with the middle one of confidence, that confidence is a really interesting value when we're looking at how young people react to these echo chambers, because some people will say that the best predictor for susceptibility to these falsehoods online is overconfidence. And that's what it might look like from the outside, but often that seeming overconfidence is actually a real lack of confidence, and what these young people are then looking for is something that they find in easy answers online. So don't confuse overconfidence for actually probably quite serious underconfidence. So it's about building that confidence in a really positive way, not arrogance, but that confidence of knowledge, but the humility that goes with it. And I think curiosity is vital, because genuine curiosity, when we're looking into a certain topic, will come with a very healthy dose of humility as well. And again, very linked to that kindness factor, that I think we protect our young people from the dangers and the snares of online echo chambers or sycophantic feedback loops if they're equipped with those three things. If they're equipped with kindness and curiosity and their own quiet confidence, they're going to start comparing what they see online with the reality of what they see around them. If they're seeing misogynistic content, if they're curious about the people around them, they're talking to the people around them, they'll realise that actually what's being peddled to them online doesn't ring true at all with the women around them in their life. So if we equip them properly with those three values, they're going to be able to resist some of these snares online.
And I mean, absolutely agree. We're all going to violently agree, I suspect, today. So apologies if you came looking for a scrap. But just to draw those answers together, absolutely agree with them. The concept of objective truth is a really important concept, as is the need for curiosity. And the only thing I would add into that, which I think is just a re-articulation of what you've already heard, is, and it maybe is something that schools and parents can try to teach multiple times to relate to different situations, is the idea of sitting with complexity. So an objective truth does not mean a simple truth at all. And one of the great dangers confronting young people today is that they are given simple answers to complex situations. And we see that in politics, we see that in sort of soundbitism, which has been it's been a political tool since time immemorial. But those online sources they encounter give them simple answers, and simple answers are incredibly attractive and almost always wrong, because they are simple. They often confuse correlation and causation, for example, or they simply pick the facts that they want to confirm whatever biases they're trying to present. So one thing that we can do as educators is to try to show, and more importantly to try to allow young people to discover for themselves, that the world is complex, that the concept of a simplistic answer to complex problems is rarely true and rarely helpful. And actually that's quite disconcerting for a young person. So giving them permission to sit with that uncomfortable truth that things are complex in the world. That doesn't mean that there is no objective truth. It just means that the objective truth often needs to be explored in depth. You need that curiosity in order to achieve a real understanding of what's going on. So that's the only thing I'm down.
I'm going to put my historian's hat on for a moment, if I may. Going to your starting point, Elizabeth, about your class that were so reluctant to make any judgment, or there are, or there not, different types of prevarication as to why one wouldn't give an answer, and that might be due to the anticipated emotional risk to others, maybe in the sense of your class, who don't want to offend anybody, or the emotional risk to yourself, which is what intellectual humility actually opens up. The ability for a young boy to sit in a class and go, I don't know, is an emotional risk if there is an environment that can sometimes exist amongst, well, not just young boys, but any children, or indeed an environment that the online world promotes, which is ready and easy criticism because you don't know that, and you should know that because either it's easy or everybody knows that, or whatever it may be. And one of the features I sense of the online culture such as it is everybody's willingness to give categorical, simplistic, over-reductive opinions, which our young people may risk as perceiving as truth rather than repetition. Where is the distinction between repetition and truth? And whereas I absolutely agree, who couldn't, with the idea that knowledge has to underpin the ability with which you can apply critical thinking skills, there are certain tenets which I think to young children you need to apply to help them to ask the question of themselves, what is it that makes me think this is true? So as a history teacher, it becomes really difficult teaching history to boys this age if you want to try and get into the slightly higher level thinking skills, because it does become over-reductive. Okay, here's a historical source. Do you trust it? Yes. Why do you trust it? Well, because it was published in a book in 2012, so you assume it's well researched. What about this one? Well, that was written in 1832 when they had far more Victorian values that meant that it can be quite reductive, but at least it's teaching them the skills to look at a point of provenance and authorship, and to go, well, this could be worth questioning, and this could be something that you have to bear in mind. So, is there an explicit set of skills alongside the knowledge piece that we think should be explicit within our teaching, or is it implicit through good knowledge learning and good teaching?
Well, reading, that's a skill, right? I think reading used to be about access to thought, access to knowledge. It obviously still is that, but also reading is more effort. And so the skill of persevering with the thought for longer and holding, more complex language, which is developing more and balancing, because of this, but that, so this, it's very, again, try and do that visually. That's just not going to happen. So I think wide reading is just a broad-based skill that is going to support them in all of those things. At one end of I'm sort of repeating the point I made earlier, but at one end of the spectrum, it is a mistake with young people or old people to just present this is the truth, because almost anything can be contested to some degree, almost. But it is equally a mistake to, if your sole focus is not on history but on historiography, which is what was the agenda of this person when they wrote it. And if that's what you're spending all your time doing, that's the Foucauldian thing, right? Which is, what was their agenda? Why would, what point are they pushing here? And it pulls you, the implicit thing there is that there's no point striving for a truth because you'll never get it. And that breaks down human relationships, because if Tim and I have a difference of opinion, and I think it's just about an exercise of power, and that there's no point engaging in argument with him, because the argument's beside the point. That's not what we're arguing about, it's about who's more powerful. That's the dynamic between you know, a lot of the pointless sort of slogan throwing. And so balancing that as parents, I mean, you will have more influence as a parent than any of us do as educators. And I would much rather have a parent who was taking a view of the world that, you know, even if I found it quite, you know, not to my taste, I'd rather that they had a view, and, you know, obviously, not too extreme, but, you know, I think it's healthier to have a view, because newsflash, they're going to reject you anyway, instead of, you know, teaching your children, oh, well, it could be this and it could be that, and there's no way of knowing. Like, I just think that's not a helpful way forward. And there is something, I haven't, I'm only starting to think this through for myself, so it's sort of inchoate in my own mind. But there is a nihilism about not believing in anything. I mean, how embarrassing would it be now to talk, for a young man to talk about a sense of honour? Like, there's just, you know, like the football coach is not going to get a young man coming, well, I want to lead an honourable life. Like, that would just be weird, right? We don't have the language of virtue. We've lost our confidence in talking about those things. And, of course, at the extremes, those things can be just as stifling and oppressive and damaging as the opposite. But I think for young men particularly, this is really quite tough. We don't give them much to aspire to. They can't seek truth. That's, you know, that's just naive. And they can't strive for honour. And, you know, fortitude. I mean, all these very old-fashioned language, but my goodness, it gave them something to aim for. There was a really interesting, I have to remember, it was an American journalist who did an analysis of some diaries written by young women, young sort of teenage girls in the, I don't know, it was a turn of the sort of 19th to 20th century, and compared 100 years later. And the young women back then were talking about self-improvement in terms of, I mean, it's embarrassing to say it, right? You know, I'd like to be more dutiful. I'd like to be more thoughtful about others. I'm a bit, you know, they were talking in terms that just we don't have the language for now. Then she compared it to the diaries of the young women sort of in our time, and when they were talking about self-improvement, it's I'm going to exercise every day and I'm going to lose this much and I'm going to look like this and I'm going to, you know, if we don't give our children a vision of what is worth it in life, they go searching, right? And they'll find someone who's talking about the sort of the belonging and the certainty. They're internally, they're quite uncertain, and so therefore they go looking for people who have it. So, you know, without wanting to go sort of full totalitarianism, I don't think there's anything wrong, in fact quite the reverse, in us standing for something and being really clear about that.
I'd absolutely agree with that. I think in society there is a great reluctance to give young men and boys a picture of what it is to be them as they grow up, and that is being taken by, you know, those people online. You know, Andrew Tate is obviously the most famous example of that, and people talk about the misogyny of that rule, but if you actually look at what those influencers are doing, they don't start out with misogyny. They start out with purpose. They start out by explicitly using words like honour and what it is to be a man and so on. And that sense of purpose is what boys really need. And in the absence of alternative models of what it means to be those things, because there's a sort of reluctance to state that for young males, then they find this solution. And the solution starts with, you know, if you look at these websites, they start with fitness, health, how you look, wealth, finance, how you could become powerful through being rich, how you could become powerful through being attractive. And the more insidious elements of them are slipped into that narrative. They are not the purpose of the narrative, but they become a definition of what it is to be a man. And when you've got that really strongly being rolled out on one side, and a reluctance to engage with the concept on the other side, then you've got an imbalance, and therefore you're going to have young boys and men who are drawn to that attractive but fundamentally destructive sort of approach. So having that sense of values, having that rather traditional sense of right and wrong in simple terms is a really important thing, and it has to be explicit. So there we get to explicitness. We have to outline directly what it is to be a good man for young male people. They have to have those role models readily available.
And I think we'll probably come on to that in terms of how we instill that in a culture of a school and how we work with parents. But just bringing it back to the curriculum and the nuts and bolts of how we can do this, I totally agree with Elizabeth that we've got to keep educating our young people with traditional knowledge. Just knowing about a subject is the biggest weapon in their armoury. But alongside that, I think we need to do both. We need to teach critical thinking as well as giving them that knowledge. So at Brighton we have a head of critical thinking who meets with the heads of department, and they identify areas of each of those subjects in the curricula where you can insert those elements of critical thinking at the right moments. But we also have specific courses that teach some of those skills at strategic points in the pupil's journey. So in years 7 and 8, they're taught the story of our land, which is a combined RS history and geography course, and it's peppered with critical thinking for those young developing minds. You go through the GCSE years where your history courses will teach NOP in source analysis, what's the nature of this source, what's the origin, what's the purpose. So through those subjects there's very obvious areas where we're teaching them to be critical when they're looking at sources. But as they head into the sixth form, we have a course called Our Human Story, which is essentially a critical thinking course. And one of the lessons we teach is to look at an internet meme and actively deconstruct it, get the pupils thinking about, what is this trying to achieve, get them using the language that Elizabeth mentioned, language of evidence, of bias. I'll give you an example of the meme just to sort of, bring it to life. This is a meme called the Hard Times meme, and it always has 4 pictures. There's lots of different varieties of it on the internet. So the first one is that hard times create strong men, and the image I have in my mind is American soldiers sort of raising the flag on Iwo Jima, and then the next section is strong men create good times, and then the next one is good times create weak men, and then weak men create hard times. And you can see what that meme is trying to do. So what we do in those critical thinking sessions is deconstruct what is this trying to say, how does it make you feel? Because one thing we haven't really touched on is the emotion that some of these internet memes or online echo chambers will create in these young people. How are they feeling? So it's for them to analyse not only what they're reading, but what sensations does it make them feel? Is this rage bait that they're reading? Are they falling into certain traps? And so it's about deconstructing those memes, the darker corners of the web, and giving them agency to say, what is it these people want me to think? It's saying to them, actually, you don't have to just submit to this, this theory or this ideology that they're trying to instill in you for whatever reason. It's about thinking critically, why is this there? What is it trying to achieve?
Thank you, Chris. And bringing it back to the classroom was where I was going to perhaps try and just bring this particular aspect in question together. Obviously they're mutual in many respects, but how do we? Is there a distinction between finding ways to do this in the classroom, and if we do, is that something we're going to be doing explicitly, and creating a culture within a school, or indeed within a family, where we are supporting the skills that essentially are looking for sort of truth-seeking and respectful challenge and those sorts of things? Where's the relationship between the classroom and the culture, and what questions does that force us to confront as educational leaders? How do we try to seek to achieve those things in our schools.
So culture's in the classroom, it's across the school, it's in families, it's in the community, and to sort of misuse a phrase, culture trumps curriculum every single time. So it's always going to be about role modelling the values that you hold at the school, the role modelling the values you hold as a family. So when we're talking about that sense of complexity, one of the interesting things that schools do is they set rules. And traditionally schools would set rules based on the fact that those rules exist and therefore they ought to exist and it becomes this little loop of never actually thinking about what the rule is and what its purpose is. And that, I think, is something which you need to role model open-mindedness to. So as a school, you need to be able to accept fallibility, you need to be able to accept change, you need to be able to role model that to young people so that they see that that as a school you are questioning yourself. And so that gives them permission to question their own knowledge base, to question their assumptions. And that's a really important thing that schools do. And it doesn't mean saying yes, incidentally, because also these are children. So saying yes is sometimes absolutely appropriate, sometimes not. But what it means is explaining why no. And that's something that both families and schools can do. Where you say, no, this is the rule, and this may be the rule because it's my values that I hold, it may be the rule because it's safety, it protects you in some way, but here's why.
And can I also say, that part of that too is your life is not solely about you. You are part of a network of relationships and part of the community. And that's, I think, again, I mean, you think about, this is the kind of, Rolling Alone, whatever his name is, the author. The demise of communal institutions, from local sports clubs to, the church, temple, all of that. Schools are one of the last communal institutions that exist, which is why so much gets put on us, which is actually about, society building. I just think it's not a bad lesson in life to have to put up with something that you don't agree with for the sake of making things work for everybody else. And the hyper-individualism, which is the outworkings of liberalism, which was good, right? The attentiveness to individual rights and freedoms, that's part of, what makes our civilization what it is and why so many people want to come and live in places that have that political and philosophical heritage. That outworking is good until it gets into the extremes. And hyper-individualism is also something that we struggle with because children and parents who intellectually agree that service of others is important will nevertheless quite frequently come in and demand a bespoke solution for their child. And sometimes we think it's the wrong solution for that child, or sometimes I think, well, yeah, I can see it works better for your child, but I can't run a school on 900 bespoke solutions, right? We're also part of community, and that's part of it. And so part of it is, using an unfashionable word, subordinating at times your own preferences to because you are part of something that is bigger than you. Again, that is, we have the language of personal expression down pat, and that is seen as inspirational and so on. Where we have lost a lot of the language, which is about service and subordination of self for others and so on. It's not an easy sell, in this day and age. Which is why I think schools as communities are important. For us as a boarding school and a full boarding school, it's incredibly important because you don't get to, even the sort of 6 or 7 hours of classroom time and a bit after school, they actually come back to the boarding house and they still have to be thinking about other people. I mean, this is hard, right? And they'd like to drop their bundle and go into their single room and just do what they want, and they're confronted with, I'm still living in community, and if I don't treat the people around me well, then next morning I'm going to wake up next to the kid that I treated poorly yesterday. I'm going to have to live with it. And so there is, in terms of coming back to your thing, Tim, about what can we all be doing, if parents are sort of confident about values and speaking about that, knowing that your children will probably reject some of them, that's okay, but it's better than not having any. But if you can also be putting them in the context of something that is bigger than them, and I don't know, again, this is sort of me straying out onto rather thin ice because it's not my area of expertise, but I do wonder about the sort of secularisation. We are a school that has a 600-year-old Christian foundation. They all go to chapel, they go to faith circles if they're, of different faith or none, But dedicated time is spent every single week to sitting still, thinking about higher things, thinking about something that is bigger than you, and just carving out time for some sort of experience of, beauty and ideas of truth and goodness. As a society, that is missing from most young people's lives, and whether or not they agree with it, I don't think it's a bad thing for that to kind of be this subtle pulse within the organism. There's something there, I think, about, I don't know if you watched the Louis Theroux documentary, The Manosphere one, and there's this just hilarious bit where this young man who's all the things that you would expect on that documentary about the Manosphere, and introduces his girlfriend as his dishwasher and so on. Anyway, his mother comes along, he's like, oh, I can't say it, she'd slap me. And you can't live up close with one of these men and be fooled, right? You can't. The reason it works is because you get the curated edition of them. That's why communities are important, because there's no hiding yourself and others in it. And by the way, I think for day parents, if you're thinking ahead through adolescence, they are wired to be expanding their community and their networks beyond home, beyond the nuclear family. And if you cling on to them too tightly, and you don't allow those other networks to draw up, you're in a world of trouble. That's, again, part of the problem. So finding a way for them to have those relationships and networks is kind of built into a boarding school in a way. But I think that's a really important part of preparing for that part of life.
I wonder if discernment has been eroded in school cultures, partly because there's been a bit of a misunderstanding of the guidance from the government that schools should be impartial. I don't think that means shying away from the difficult questions. And I think it's so important that schools address what is happening in the world and don't just think, on balance, it's just too difficult to say anything. Saying something is always better because it creates that debate, it creates people actively engaging, being curious about each other. And I think having evidence of that engagement in the school communities is important. We have our Syrian Scholars Programme, we have Ukrainian Scholars Programme, and it's much harder, for instance, to be drawn into sort of anti-refugee rhetoric online if you're sitting next to someone in maths who has arrived from Ukraine the year before and you actually know something about their life. So I come back to those values again of curiosity and kindness, that if you are genuinely curious, you will approach people who are different to you, and even people who you fervently disagree with kindness and with a genuine curiosity to find out what it is they're saying. Whereas too much at the moment we're seeing an argument needing to be won. There's no genuine interest in somebody's polar opposite opinion. We perhaps saw that yesterday in the collapse of the middle ground in the local elections. Everybody is moving towards the extremes, but there's not enough communication between those extremes to understand each other. And I think schools have a really, really important role to play, and indeed a responsibility to make sure that that these big issues are actually tackled in schools.
At the risk of losing the audience and getting yourself trained out of Pilgrims. But I think we also make assumptions, and we make assumptions from our own point of view. I'll give you an example. My son is 19, and he's at university, and he texted me because it was his first opportunity to vote yesterday. I'm not going to say which way he voted, that's his information, and I'll leave it with him. But sort of coming from a very sort of Gen X liberal background, I thought I'd take the opportunity just to ask about his anecdotal experience of voting, preferences of his, quite trendy, quite sort of high-achieving crowd of fellow students. And what was interesting to me was I had sort of instantly leapt to the assumption that his friends and him were going to be sort of universally left of centre, and that in his particular university this would drive a big turnout from the Green Party or something like that. And he was really clear. He said, he's got a lot of friends, he's a very sociable person, maybe a bit too sociable for my liking in his first year at university. But he was very clear that his friends were almost directly split down the middle. And this is a wide group of friends, not a small group. And they are almost directly split down the middle between those who are voting Green and those who are voting Reform. None of them are voting traditional parties. And I think, as I say, I'm not here to talk about politics because that will get me drummed out of the school. But actually what I'm here to talk about is the fact that we will also make assumptions. And we need to understand that we're not living the lives of a younger generation. And actually some of our assumptions may be wrong. And if we don't understand their perspective, then how can we possibly help them to navigate the world? There isn't this sort of single version of a young person that conforms to a sort of a guardian stereotype of what a young person should be. It just doesn't exist. They are passionate and they are truth-seeking as they see it. They want direction, they want purpose, but they are not all going in the same direction. They are finding their own routes. And so sort of glib single solutions based on our perceptions of what it is they must want is a very dangerous route to take as well. You have to actually sit alongside them and get to know them. And that absolutely applies to parents, where actually the one thing that we can do as parents is create a space where if they say something that we don't agree with, we don't turn it into a lecture and an opportunity to just sort of push them down, close them down, and shove them out the room. Because then they will go to someone else. And so the ability to accept that they may not always fulfill what we feel they ought to in terms of their views and their passions is probably a skill that we as parents and schools have to learn. And it is a skill because everything in your brain is screaming out to go, conform to what I believe is right. And we have to be able to live with the fact that they do need to find their own way. And if we're not there to help them by listening to them and navigating that, then they'll just go and find someone else who will. And then we'll be out of the loop and we won't be in any position to help them at all.
Thank you, Neil. And it prompts me to just speculate. I wonder, yes, they're finding their own way, but you use the word conform, and often young people seek to conform within their social groups, and you describe a big social group as more or less split between two, which I find interesting because we started this discussion talking about the human instinct, and often the young human's instinct, to seek a dichotomy, the heroes versus the villains, and I wonder out loud whether we've gone from a sort of effectively a two-party state of Conservative and Labour to, for some generations, a two-party option between Reform and Green. It's the bipolarity that's appealing, and this narrative fits for me or this narrative fits for me. I wonder out loud. In order to move through to Q&A, I'm sure we've got some waiting. Can we just finish, and by all means you can knock this question down as a straw man. In an age of overwhelming information, after all that discussion, is there a single most important habit of mind that we should be trying to develop for our young men or our young people, or is it far more complex?
It's difficult, isn't it? In one word, I might allow myself a sort of umbrella word. I would go back to curiosity because I think within it sits so much. It's the humility, the kindness, but a genuine curiosity, I think, instills that discernment and protects our young people from the dangers of half-truths.
No, I'm still thinking.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. It absolutely is a strong question. There is no single answer. Is the truth, because we come back to that sense of complexity and nuance. But to steal Chris's earlier expression and essentially to steal his answer, I think that sense of intellectual humility is certainly a starting point, a very strong starting point. The idea of learning that I could be wrong is a really good starting point. But combined with confidence but I might be right. And those two things I think are a starting point. But yeah, if that's the end of it, then we're not going to make any progress.
No, I haven't got a neatly packaged single thing. I think it was St. Augustine, he talked about, it could be wrong, wrong saint, but talked about the purpose of education is to grow in love and wisdom. And it seems to me those two things, sit together, and they touch on that thing about just, isolated bits of knowledge which aren't connected to a wider perspective on the world, aren't, can easily be manipulated and lead you astray, and it's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. But the grow in love bit is about never losing contact with the people around you. And that, I think, if we're thinking about it in isolation as a knowledge problem, we're going to miss one of the key things that keeps us grounded, because if I'm seriously connected with other people, I probably am going to have some humility, because I realise that the whole world is smarter than I am, right? And I am going to be challenged about, well, I thought this was 100% true, but actually the person sitting next to me is living evidence of not that. So there's something about the quality of the learning and then the context in which it happens.
Thank you very much. It's been a wide-ranging and fascinating discussion so far. You're very welcome, should you like, to raise your hands to ask a question. We can have Q&A for a short while.
I think all three of you hit the nail on the head, or hit various nails on the head. Elizabeth, knowledge; Chris, before you have knowledge, you have curiosity; and Neil, in actually supporting a meaningful debate, even if you don't disagree with it. One of the concerns I have is, how do we make the amassing of knowledge, how do we make that attractive? I mean, okay, as educators, that's a big part of your brief. But I always reckon that the rot started, Minoan script 5,000 years ago, so people didn't have to remember stuff. And then another
Plato thought that too.
Another nail got banged in the coffin when the Gutenberg did this movable type stuff, and then come the 80s and 90s, relational databases came in, and who needs to remember anything ever? But if you don't have it in your head, or even some familiarity of an area in your head, it's very, very difficult to actually start putting the bits together that allow you to decide whether something is believable or not. My apologies for that. I spent 35, 40 years hiring engineers and research scientists at all levels. What really concerned me is how they appeared to get narrower and narrower as time went on. We'd have development meetings and I'd throw something in the middle of the table, and a PhD would stand up and say, I don't know anything about that, and you can't ask me to work on that. I said, well, unless you lied on your CV, which I'm assuming you know a lot about that, but you also know something about that, and because you know those two things, you should know something about this. And I've asked you about something that's in the middle. So put all of that stuff together, and you do know something. How do we actually, and you can only do that when you've actually stuffed your head full of stuff that's meaningful. How do we make that attractive when there's so many options these days to take the easy route? And just, oh, look it up, just Google it.
Okay, so somewhere in the 16th century, a polymath got overwhelmed. It was no longer possible for one educated person to know, read everything and know. Right? That was the end of that era. Somewhere in probably the 19th century, we lost the capacity for a single very clever mathematician to know all the mathematics, right? It just, everything, we're just amassing too much of it. And so the reason we have not somehow lost capacity to progress, but accelerated it, is because we trust other people. Right? So I don't have to know everything, because if I go to the right person who tells me how something works, I can trust that. We were reading somewhere about that, I don't know when it was, maybe in the 60s or something, we passed the threshold where no single person could understand how an airline was built. Right? It's too much expert stuff that has to be brought together. And I guess that comes back to this idea of community, which is that if we're not actually in healthy, trusting relationships, then we can't actually build on the sort of the social benefits of having widespread, highly expert stuff. I'm going to give you a very Winchester College specific answer to your question of how do we create people who are going to be willing to take intellectual risks and to go beyond what they're comfortable with. We've got an education system which cultivates risk aversion because we've got high stakes exams driving right from the, so whether it's, common entrance, 11 plus, GCSEs, A-levels, we are in a system where, and that's starting to fragment, right, I suspect, but we're in a system where highly desirable things are rationed according to how will you perform in quite narrowly defined tasks. And because it's high stakes, exam boards have to have systems of assessment which stand up to incredibly narrow scrutiny, So therefore they have to be very, very specific. We're going to ask this type of question, and this is what has to come out at the end of it. And so that then tends to narrow the teaching, which is when you see this trigger word in this style of question, what you need to remember is these 3 bullet points that we talked about earlier, and that's the only acceptable answer. We run some things in the college. I was comparing last year an essay on Macbeth, which one of the examples, this is grade 9 at GCSE, with the winning essay in our internal competition. And the head of English was saying, look, an Oxford English novel looked at it and said, that's about 2nd or 3rd year undergraduate level. And the head of English is saying that will get marked down at GCSE. Because it's bringing in extraneous knowledge and it's taking an unusual angle to the question, and So we've actually got a system, don't blame the kids, right? We've got a system which cultivates narrowness and risk aversion and predictability. So our answer to it is something like DIV, which you may have heard of, and there's videos on our website. But from the first day of school to the last day of school, they're doing another subject. We make them do the equivalent of another A-level, which counts for nothing, right? It doesn't appear on their transcript. It's unexamined, which means we don't suffer from that narrow defect. It's not unassessed. We make them write essays, they get marks for it, they get reports for it. But it allows it to be cross-disciplinary, it allows it to be much more discursive. And that is a sort of an attitude that permeates things. Every kid in sixth form in our school is going to have to do a 10 to 15 minute presentation on a piece of art in the Kenneth Clark Prize. They all have to do it. I don't care whether you're doing maths, physics and chemistry and that's your diet. You will be reading a novel in Div. You will be engaging with works of art. So our answer is that we structure that in, and that actually creates a confidence, sometimes overconfidence, but a confidence that I can have an opinion on something that somebody hasn't explicitly, handed to me, neatly packaged and said, this is what you need to know.
So it's why I want to practically go.
Oh, very good. It was totally worth it.
And on that just little pass.
I'll just wait 10 seconds. Those schools are available. So I would say 2 things in response to that question, for the rest of you too. One is that there is extraordinary beauty in the unknown. and teaching the beauty of the unknown. Now, come back to Elizabeth's point, it is a literal impossibility to know everything there is to know about the world, partly because it changes every day, but partially because there is infinite knowledge out there. You know, we come back to the sciences, and the one thing that we all know about our scientific understanding of the world right now is that it is wrong, and that it will evolve, and that's the scientific process. What was absolutely known 10 years ago is already contradicted. What was absolutely known 100 or 1,000 years ago has evolved. And I think there is great beauty and power in that, and actually that can be incredibly appealing to young people, that sense of an infinite world to discover, and get back to curiosity, having the curiosity to do that. And part of that, again, looking at what KES does with that, so we deliberately a couple of years ago reduced the content that we do at GCSEs. We actually reduced the number of GCSEs our pupils took, because GCSEs are incredibly reductive. I mean, as an educator, I'm not a big fan of GCSEs, truth be told, because they place young people in a situation where they slog memorising information and ticking boxes. And there's sort of this strange sort of structure to education whereby they sort of say, well, we'll get them thinking once they get past 16. And that's really late in a young person's development. So we instead took the space that we had within the Key Stage 4, the sort of year 10, year 11 GCSE year groups, to put in, very similarly actually, a non-exam course. And we call it Elevate, and it's about this deep thinking, it's engaging with politics and these issues, and having genuine debate and teaching people how to debate. It's about evaluation of sources. One of the things we do within it is a sort of seeing the world in a grain of sand approach to life. So I'm teaching, I'm myself a teacher actually, and I've got a lesson on this next week. We, for example, will give the pupils a single city of their choice. Choose a city in this world and explore it. And simply explore it and see what you can discover about it. And see how the history of the city has influenced the food and the culture and the demographics, and see how those things then cross-pollinate back again. And just explore the fact that with a relatively small, I know a city is a big thing, but compared to sort of global geopolitical things, it's a relatively defined small thing. You can run out of time to learn anything about it. You know, when I used to teach music more than I do now, I was often confronted with A-level students saying, but what if I don't know what to say in the exam? What if I run out of knowledge in the exam? And as an intellectual exercise, I used to say, well, I tell you what we'll do is we'll write an essay about the first bar of Stravinsky's Writer's Spring. And I will give you the first bar and write me an essay. We'll do it as an intellectual exercise. Because if you, instead of being reductive and reducing everything down to what can I say about things, if you take a single bar of Stravinsky's Writer's Spring and you contextualize it, you understand that this comes from his Russian background, his move to Paris and so on, and it comes from the environment that was set up by the Impressionists, and you keep on rolling out. Ultimately, you could never run out of things to say about the first bar of the Writer's Spring, notwithstanding the fact that it's an awesome piece of music anyway. And so that seeing the world in a grain of sand allows pupils to have a really easy route to understanding that the possibilities out there are boundless, and that in and of itself is an extraordinarily beautiful thing. It's a little uncomfortable at times, but really beautiful. So that's how we do it. Okay.
Would you like a chance, Chris?
Well, I'll keep it short. I can't check my understanding of the question, and I doubt I'll ever see that gentleman in Brighton to have a look around both. My understanding of his question is how, in an age of sort of quick information, how do we give our young people a genuine thirst for knowledge? And Tim, I'm sorry to throw you a hospital pass, but it probably starts younger, doesn't it? I think we all agree that we need to find space in our timetables amongst the heavily examined subjects for genuine thinking and critical thought. I'm sure we all do very similar things in that regard, but those exam drivers are strong. By then, pupils need to have an independent thirst for knowledge that is not in the straitjacket of exam requirements, and that starts not only in schools at a young age, but we haven't talked much about the sort of relationship between home and school yet, but it's also the power of the Sunday roast. You know, are families sitting down together and discussing things? Are they talking through what's happening in the world? Are they instilling that genuine curiosity in their children to actively be seeking that knowledge? And I think it also comes back to what Neil was saying before. Schools should be holding that healthy tension between seemingly contradictory opinions, and that's okay. And it's the difficult thing to manage is Elizabeth's point that we as schools also shouldn't be afraid of saying, this is right and this is wrong. But as part of that, it is okay to hold those contradictory opinions. When you're navigating the Israel-Gaza war in a school, how do you talk about that in assemblies? And I think the way that you do it is hold those truths in healthy tension. You start that debate going, you approach it with kindness. And how does this relate to knowledge? Well, it's the fact that if a child is at home having those balanced conversations, but with a strong sense by the example of the adults around them that there is absolute truth as well, but that sometimes those truths can be contradictory, that sparks a natural curiosity and a desire to have the knowledge to be able to follow those opinions through. So it's a huge partnership between everybody in this room, isn't it?
Can I pick up just on one thing you said? If I can make a suggestion, particularly with the summer holidays looming, but you're probably doing this already, but there's no harm in doing it in a structured way, like the entire family reads the same book at the same time, and then you have interesting discussions because you're all doing that at the same time. Don't be afraid to read to your children, even if they're perfectly capable of reading on their own. The first years at Winchester still get read to at bedtime by the housemaster. Or make a habit of you just, going to pick one interesting article a week and that's your Sunday roast moment. There's no harm in actually being really structured about it. It can be great fun. There's also some interesting books out there which a friend of mine, Michael Parker, has written some, I think it's like 100 philosophical questions or something, and it's designed for young people. And there's some nice ways to work through that, and that, as you rightly say, the sort of the role modelling and that sort of opportunity around the table can be quite fun.
But if you do that, choose your book wisely. my current tone is the Arteta Revolution. I'm not sure my wife would absolutely buy into the blow-by-blow account of Mikel Arteta's early years.
I'm very conscious, we've only had one question, and there may be others, but simultaneously we've run a little longer than probably many of you were expecting, and some of you may need to slip off discreetly, in which case please feel free to. I'm going to shamelessly, if I might, just take that hospital pass for 30 seconds, because it's important to me, for Pilgrims parents, to know that this sort of thing goes on in Pilgrims in terms of how we seed that curiosity, that knowledge, that, I want to go and find out more about that, and so forth. So I co-teach a general studies course with Becca Hyam for our Year 5s in anticipation of their senior school application processes and interviews and things like that. That is both on the one hand through Becca making sure that they've got the tools to know how to manage the online test environment, which speaks to all of the things that we've been not entirely positive about recently for various reasons. And I deal with stuff that's going to try and make them interested and interesting experiences for a housemaster or whoever it may be in interview. One thing that I do, just as a quick snapshot, is we start with prehistoric human life and how, before language truly existed in an intertribal way, the way of determining how you knew whether a stranger was friendly or not was by reading their facial expressions and body language. So the human brain became highly attuned to the smallest change in lines in the face that shows whether a face is aggressive, surprised, shocked, etc. We take the starting point, we go to emojis, we say, look how few lines you need to actually express an emotion. Somebody's paid a lot of money to put 2 dots and a line in a particular place, and that shows this emotion. And they all know what the emotions are. You can say, what's this face showing? What's that face showing? And then we say, okay, so the brain's ability to interpret lines is ingrained. How does that translate into the next phase? We talk about facial recognition technology and the movement of the face, but we then go on to personification in English. How do you personify a static object? Why does an author, how can an author determine the character of this bottle if it was a person? Because if you look at the lines of it, and if it's bulbous or sleek or tall or strict in its narrowness or whatever it is, you can infer a personality into something that is simply an object. That's what literature does. And then, final steps, we translate that into architecture. And I give them some contrasting examples of buildings and say, what do the lines of this building communicate? Because the architects designed every single bit of it. Why? Why have they put that bit there? What message is that giving? And of course, I give them some really something great obvious examples, like, Albert Speer in the Nazi period and all of this, second generation Roman Empire, huge, monolithic stone stuff, and then some very nice sort of 1960s glass cubist sort of architecture to do with transparency in post-World War II world. Never patronise your children. They can grasp more sophisticated concepts than you think they might be able to. I do that with year fives. I probably flatter myself, but I don't think that every boy necessarily gets to the end of that little series of lessons and goes, I completely understand everything from the first part to the last part. But it gives them some tools by which to go into the more intellectually curious and sort of stretching areas of senior school, go, remember that thing about facial recognition or whatever it is that they might do. So I hope that we're doing a good job by your boys as well as preparing them for the necessary exams. Coming back to that point.